All right, what is public speaking? That's the question we're going to answer today. Well, I always like to start my presentations with quotes because I try to find quotes that really talk about what we're going to cover in the lesson. This one comes from Confucius, and he says, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, and I do and I understand. When you look at that, what do we see the three basic forms of learning? Listening, we see visual, we see the kinesthetic. Kinesthetic meaning hands-on. I think that's appropriate to public speaking in the sense that in this class we're going to talk about public speaking. You're going to hear speeches, you're hearing me. And if you just had that, Confucius says you forget. Okay? Visually, when you watch someone, you get a little more, it gets a little more ingrained, you remember it a little bit better. But I think the best form of when we talk about public speaking is actually doing it, because that's where it's going to stick. You get that, we always talk about gaining experience. That's really kind of where we're at. And once you get that experience, you understand it a lot more. Now, as far as where public speaking started, it started in its earliest known, earliest we've known about it is in the ancient Greek. In the ancient Greece culture, if you could speak, it was very prestigious. You were a very prestigious person, and what really is kind of interesting with all of it is that we look at people like Aristotle, who really kind of gathered all of the different types of public speaking that was going on. There were the people that were what we'd consider attorneys today. They had their own form of public speaking and so on. And so it really carried with it this high prestige. And because of this high prestige, if you could do it, stuff wasn't written down, apparently, from what I understand, prior to Aristotle. And so it was kind of looked down upon to write it down. But if you could just get up there and give it, you were pretty in the upper echelon of people. And I think that's where the natural ability comes into play when we, that person's got a natural ability to speak in public. But I think that's because this was kind of what was going on back in ancient Greece, and it just kind of carried over. And before Aristotle, it was really never studied on a theoretical level. It was just done. And when Aristotle came along and gathered all of this information, started putting it together, he created a school, and it was studied. And the other part of this, if you weren't part of the aristocracy, you were looked down upon. You were looked like a clown in their eyes. Okay? And so there are folks that look at it as that it's just instinctive, it's part of us. And then you have others who talk, let's kind of look at this. Do you think public speaking can be learned? You wouldn't be in this class if you didn't think so, right? But there's always this cross between people thinking they can't learn it and people that feel like they already know it, and so we have also natural ability versus learned ability. We do have characteristics that we can carry over into public speaking that's natural, that we maybe grew up with. But in essence, we ended up learning it from whatever environment we were in. So if you weren't in an environment where public speaking was a thing that you did, you didn't learn it. But then you have the people that grew up in those environments and learned it, but then people will look at them like, wow, you have this great ability. Little did we know that they learned it along the way. And so there's always this difference in whether people think it's a natural thing or whether it's learned. And I personally believe anybody can be a public speaker. I went through this process. I was not a public speaker, and eventually I learned and got better at it with more experience and so on. So let's get down to what public speaking is, and we're going to talk about Aristotle specifically. Aristotle gave us three, what they call proofs or appeals. You've probably heard these before. Oops, missed a note, sorry. Let me back up just a second here. So it can come natural, but it can be learned. When you hear, when Aristotle, his study of it, you'll hear the term rhetoric, which means discovering all available means of persuasion. And he broke all those available means of persuasion down to three components. The first one, and they can be included in, sorry about this, and my notes are a little bit off, I apologize. You can find these proofs or appeals in both informative and persuasive presentations. And through public speaking, these three proofs and appeals, we get to know the mind of the person that's giving the speech, their beliefs, their truths. So, the three proofs and appeals are this. First one is logos. You've heard that term, right? Logos meaning logic, facts, figures. Do you think those are a key component of a speech?
Yes.
If you want someone to be persuaded, you want them to learn, give them facts, figures. And that's considered the intellectual aspect of it. You have pathos. Okay? Pathos is really about emotion. Do you think emotion is a key component when you're giving a speech? If I stood up here and talked and didn't really have any emotion at all, do you think you guys would continue to listen? Probably
Only because
not.
we have to.
Only because you have to. But for a speech to be effective, it has to have that emotional component. The logic part of it, the emotion part of it. And we also have the ethos aspect, or the character of the person. In some ways, the logic and the emotion can create the character of a person, but when a person's character is in question and they're giving a speech, do you think it can cause some problems? Are you going to believe their logic? Are you going to believe the emotion that they have? Not if you have bad credibility. So it's very important. Of all of these, credibility is very important. And you know, we look at political campaigns and how vicious they can get and negative, and people start to question credibility of various political candidates. They may be a really good person, but because others are putting this credibility issues into play, it gets us, we start to rethink about what this person is all about. And so, but in order for a presentation to be very well put together and very effective, these three things have to be involved. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, another thing that Aristotle brought forth from what he saw around him was the 5 canons of rhetoric. So let's talk about those. The first one that he talked about is invention. He called it invention. That's the logic aspect. It falls under logic, but it's the subject matter. And when we start to get into the planning process of our speeches, you're going to start to think about the subject or the topic that you are going to give a presentation on. I want you to start thinking about it. I want you to start thinking about what you could give a presentation on. And there's a reason I don't give you the subject, because it may be a subject you know nothing about. And I think the most effective speeches come from what you know already. And as we'll learn later on, if we know what we're talking about, it takes a lot of that fear that we might have away from us. You see how this kind of builds here? So subject, topic. So we called it invention or inventio and whatever, I think it was Italian that I read it. The next one is the arrangement. As far as arrangement go, it's how it's structured. We'll talk about informative speeches, how they're structured. We'll talk about persuasive speeches, how they're structured, and the order that they go into, and how at times we may need to adapt what we're doing in this particular structure to make it effective. The third thing is style. And what if you ever get the chance to read Aristotle's rhetoric, you'll see these in here. But he calls the style how it's expressed. That could be the words, that could be the emotions, all of those things that play a part in this. And we'll talk about that. Memory. He said you have to learn what you're talking about. You have to practice it. And we talk about delivery. We'll talk about how you can practice and be more effective. And then the last canon is delivery. It's the voice, your gestures, the images you use. So, what's that?
The amount of excitement.
Well, yeah, these kind of, how it's expressed and the excitement kind of works together, doesn't it? A little bit. But your tone of voice, how you gesture, the images, you're creating an image. And so in your delivery, as well as some of the other things that you put into play here. So, in essence, in looking at all of these, I came up with a definition of public speaking, and it goes like this. It's a form of communication that occurs when we plan, create, and deliver a message to others. I want you to key in on plan, create, and deliver. That's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about planning a speech. We're going to talk about creating a speech. Two different components altogether. And then we'll get to the delivery aspect. So we're going to go in that order. I also think that to be an effective communicator or public speaker, you need to expose the logic of how you got to your conclusions. Do you think that's important?
Yes.
If you go through this presentation, you don't do any research, you're not going to show how you got to whatever conclusion you got. I have seen speeches where I'll keep asking the question, how did you come up with that? And they express it like everybody knows what we're talking about, okay? And so you have to show how you came to that conclusion. You need to let people know what you're thinking and why you're thinking that. In some way, they need to be able to express back to you what they thought you said. Sometimes that's hard to do in public speaking, isn't it? Unless you're paying real close attention to body language, or if someone doesn't, or comes up and you'll be able to find out if they come up and talk to you, or if they raise their hand and ask questions. Somehow, you need to be able to have your audience express back to you what they thought you said, so you get the right message going across. This way, they can be sure that they understand you. You have to realize that if you think you didn't get your point across, you're probably right. Does that make sense? And so, if you have any question whether you got your point across, you may need to relook at it and how you presented it. Oh, over the years, I've changed how I presented things, because I've been able to start to take into consideration all of these other elements. When I was first giving speeches, it was, reading them, and I wasn't paying attention to the audience.
Probably how we will be.
Some of you, yeah. But ultimately, you're going to get to the point where you just have your notes and you look down to Adam just to
keep you on track.
Keep you on track, yeah. Well, and we'll talk about Martin Luther King later on towards the end of the class, but when we watch that speech, interesting enough, you'll notice that for the first 3/4 of the speech, he kept looking at his notes, okay? The last 7 minutes of that speech, where he was talking about his dream, he didn't look at his notes once. It was never written on his paper.
The passion he had about it.
Yeah, it came from the heart, and that's what we remember, right? That's why we call it the I Have a Dream speech. And he got his point across. So, why public speaking? It's a form of communication, okay? It's a life skill. It's a requirement for a lot of college courses. And if you look at the statistics, a lot of businesses want people that can have this ability. And so that you can use it in the workforce. So, conclusion, we've talked about the foundations of public speaking. We've talked about the proofs and appeals from Aristotle. We've talked about the 5 canons of rhetoric. And we've talked about the what and the why of public speaking. Now, there is no assignment.
Yay.
Okay?
Thanks.
The only assignment that I'm actually going to give you is to start thinking about what you want to talk about. You have 4 speeches. And these are going to be key components for the next, as we go along here, for the next little while. And so I want you to look at the 4 speeches. I want you to think about what you want to present. If you want to share with me, and I can guide you through the process of figuring out what you want to talk about, I'll be glad to do that. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, I don't see any hands, so that'll be it.